Thank you so much for having me. My office is upstairs, and so I feel like every week I come downstairs and I pop my head and see what you guys are talking about, so I feel very honored to be a part of this. So I do study presidential power and unilateral actions, but I'll make this qualifier now. I can't explain everything that's going on, but we're going to try. So today's talk, we'll talk about unilateral powers and continuing your discussion on some of these topics in American politics related to the midterm elections. So we'll start. I want to show you this video. Let's see how to turn this. So this video of President Trump that was released a couple of days ahead of a HBO documentary where he is announcing that he's going to issue an executive order that's going to revoke the whole birthright citizenship. So basically, the rights of those born in the United States to automatically become citizens. This is something that's established in the 14th Amendment. In this clip, Trump is making this announcement a week ahead of the election, saying that he plans to issue an executive order revoking that. So let's watch the video and then go into our discussion on some broader topics.
On immigration, some legal scholars believe you can get rid of birthright citizenship without changing the Constitution.
With an executive order.
Exactly.
Right.
Have you thought about that?
Yes.
Tell me more.
It was always told to me that you needed a constitutional amendment.
Right.
Guess
14th
what?
Amendment.
You don't.
You don't.
Number one, you don't need that. Number two,
I mean, that's in dispute.
You could definitely
that's very much in dispute.
Well, you can definitely do it with an act of Congress, but now they're saying I can do it just with an executive order. Now, how ridiculous. We're the only country in the world where a person comes in, has a baby, and the baby is essentially a citizen of the United States for 85 years with all of those benefits. It's ridiculous. It's ridiculous. And it has to end.
Have you talked about that with counsel?
Yeah, I have.
So where in the process?
It's in the process. It'll happen. With an executive order. That's what you're talking about, right?
Yeah,
that's
it's
a
exactly
very
what I was
interesting
talking about.
I didn't think anybody knew that but me. I thought I was the only one. Jonathan,
I've got a good guess.
I'm impressed.
All right, so this is just a clip from a documentary that's going to air on Sunday, but it was released ahead of the election. So that can raise all sorts of questions. It's actually perfect for this lecture that I have planned today, but raising all sorts of questions about what unilateral powers are. Let's try to get this. There we go. Raising all sorts of questions about unilateral powers, particularly in thinking about the upcoming midterm elections. So our questions for this lecture, we're going to start off by just talking about what exactly are unilateral powers. Where do they come from? So we're going to take some step backs and think about how do presidents get this power to issue unilateral directives? Where does it come from the Constitution? And then I'm going to talk to you a little bit about what us as political scientists have thought to try to explain why presidents use unilateral powers and when they can use them, based on maybe certain constraints that they have from other actors. And then the last part of the lecture, we'll go into specifically thinking about, well, how might President Trump's use of unilateral powers, how might that change after the midterm elections? And this will be based on what we've seen from previous presidents before and what he's done already. So let's begin with talking about, just giving you some definitions about unilateral powers, the different types. And first starting off by thinking about where exactly do they come from. So in order to address that question, we'll take an even bigger step back and think about what are all the ways that presidents can derive powers from the Constitution. And by going through this, I'll show you where exactly unilateral powers come from. So in general, we think that there are three main ways that presidents can derive power from the Constitution. We think about express powers, inherent powers, and delegated powers. I'll quickly talk about expressed and delegated powers, but it's the inherent powers that's where unilateral powers fall into. So starting with express powers, these are the powers that are specifically granted to the president in Article 2 of the Constitution. So Article 2 is the section of the Constitution that deals with kind of setting up the executive branch of government. And so we refer to those express powers as those that are actually stated in the Constitution. So these are pretty cut and dry. I'll go through some of these. So, for instance, the president's military powers. It specifically says in the Constitution, the president shall be commander-in-chief of a military. We can also think about judicial powers. So the president having the power to pardon, that's explicitly mentioned in the Constitution. The power to make treaties and receive ambassadors. Also the power to nominate judges and officials within the executive branch, to make those sorts of appointments with Senate confirmation. And then also this power to take care that the laws be faithfully executed. As head of the executive branch, this is the power to kind of oversee the implementation of the law. And then finally, in Article 1 of the Constitution, where it sets up how a bill becomes a law, this gives the president the explicit power to veto legislation in this process. So those are express powers. Then we have delegated powers. These are the powers that Congress has that they might give over to the executive branch. So in Article 1 of the Constitution, it gives Congress a lot of powers to legislate in a lot of different areas. But Congress can't do everything by itself. It needs the executive branch to implement these laws. So the Congress might delegate power over to the executive branch in order to implement these policies. And Congress does this through statute. So an example of how this works, Congress might recognize a problem. It recognizes that it lacks the actual manpower or expertise to deal with this problem. And so it delegates authority and says to the executive branch that you can deal with this problem. A big example of this is you can think about all the New Deal policies that were passed in the 1930s to deal with the economic and social crises during the time where Congress delegated a lot of authority. But really, any sorts of statutes, Congress needs help from the executive branch. So these are delegated powers, Congress giving over some authority that they have to the executive branch to deal with those sorts of powers. And then we have the last type of powers, probably the most controversial of the three, and those are inherent powers. So these are powers that aren't explicitly stated in the Constitution, but this is something that the president has inferred from vague language of the Constitution that he or she can do. So basically the president exploiting some sort of vague language in the Constitution to do more, but not explicitly stated in the Constitution. So these are these powers that the president has expanded over time. And so there's a lot of different vague clauses in the Constitution. There are two vague ones that I want to point out that the president derives a lot of power from. The first is the vesting clause, in the very first clause in the very first section of Article 2 that says the executive power shall be vested in a president of the United States. President has taken this to mean that the presidents solely are responsible for implementation of the law, for overseeing the executive branch. And so presidents have taken that and justified doing a lot of things in order to make sure that they oversee the executive branch, that they have this power. And the same thing with the take care clause. The president, he shall take care that the law be faithfully executed. Presidents have taken this to justify a lot of actions in order to implement the law. And so this is where a lot of these other unilateral actions come from, this take care clause. So these vague sections, we don't really know from the text what they're saying. Presidents have exploited that and used that to derive a lot of additional powers from the Constitution based on these vague sections. So let me give you some examples. The first is war powers. So I showed you in the Constitution that it says that the president is the commander-in-chief of the Army and Navy. So the presidents have taken that and extended more power out of that. So the fact that we see presidents engaging in a lot of military action without the approval of Congress, even though the Constitution, it says only Congress has the power to declare war. But because of this vague language of the commander-in-chief clause, presidents have used that to justify a lot of other military actions that they do. So that's an example of inherent powers. Same thing with making treaties. So in the Constitution, it says the president shall have the power to make treaties, but this treaty has to be approved by the Senate or ratified by the Senate. As an inherent power over time, presidents have used that to justify their ability to engage in executive agreements. So basically, these have the same effect as treaties, informal agreements between different foreign leaders, but these executive agreements don't have to be ratified by the Senate. So this is another example of inherent power that the president's derived. But the one that we want to talk about for today are unilateral actions. Remember I told you that in the Constitution it says the president shall take care the laws be faithfully executed. Well, the president has thought several presidents have thought that this justifies unilateral actions, that the president should be able to issue these in order to direct the implementation of the law so that they can take care that the laws be faithfully executed. So unilateral actions are an example of these inherent powers. So this is where it comes from, the Constitution. And particularly these inherent powers, over time, presidents have relied more greatly on this theory of the unitary executive, which I'll explain in a second. And this has been driving, basically, a comprehensive justification of the use of these inherent powers that several presidents, at least since Nixon, have used. So let's talk about this. What exactly is this unitary executive theory? So under this theory, and again, this is something that presidents use to justify their actions, it's thought that the president should have sole responsibility of the executive branch. That comes from that vesting clause in the Constitution that says executive power shall be vested in a president. Presidents have meant to be that they should have sole responsibility of the executive branch, and basically no other branch of government is going to get in their way of doing that. And so from that, presidents have taken that to mean that Congress does not have the right to limit presidential power. And additionally, that presidents should have independent authority to interpret the Constitution, independent from Congress and independent from the courts. And so you see this sort of justification for unilateral actions, that they're issuing these unilateral actions to offer their own interpretation of the law. So it's part of this theory. And then also in this theory, the president has the duty to defend against unconstitutional encroachments of their own power. So basically, if Congress or the courts try to step in and constrain or limit their powers, the presidents point to this theory as a way of saying that we have the right to kind of go around those sorts of constraints from the other branches of government, and that they're not bound to follow unconstitutional acts of Congress or the courts. That's, again, another justification of presidents doing all sorts of things that are outside traditional powers, because they're trying to go around following what they see as unconstitutional acts. We see that a lot if you're familiar with signing statements, presidents issuing signing statements saying that they're not going to follow laws that they think are unconstitutional. So just some implications of this theory. This concentrates a lot of power with the president when presidents use these sorts of arguments. It also insulates presidents from constraints from other branches of government. So it basically justifies their ability to go around the other branches of government. And it's been used as a legal justification for the presidents expanding their powers over time. So the president's ability to, say, remove officials from the executive branch, they use this theory to justify that. For our purposes, this has been used as another justification for the president's use of unilateral actions. So now with that kind of background, we kind of see where unilateral actions, at least how the president justifies these actions, where they might come from, tangentially from the Constitution. Let's go into talking about some definitions about what exactly are unilateral actions, what are some types of these actions. Okay. So we can define a unilateral action as any formal action of the president that's designed to influence policy outside of the traditional legislative process. So generally, we think about when policy is made, it should become a law through the legislative process. Congress passes a bill, the president signs a bill, et cetera. But we think about unilateral actions as all the things that the president can do outside of this process. That's a pretty broad definition. When you hear about unilateral actions, probably in the news and elsewhere, most people talk about unilateral directives, which is a type of unilateral action. So you can think about directives as being these formal statements that presidents actually sign that are directed towards giving instructions to agencies or instructions to those outside of government. Again, outside of the traditional legal process. So unilateral actions, kind of the big subset of unilateral actions, the big universe, there's unilateral actions, anything outside the legislative process. You can think about directives being a subset. Those are basically the written statements. A lot of times in the news, you'll hear them used interchangeably, unilateral directives interchangeably with unilateral actions, which is interchangeable with unilateral powers. In general, we're all referring to the same thing here. What's distinct about unilateral actions from other types of presidential powers is that it gives presidents the ability to act first, so they can preempt legislation by issuing unilateral actions, and it gives presidents the ability to act alone. Whereas through the legislative process, you have 535 members of Congress trying to work together. That might be hard to do. With unilateral actions, it gives presidents the advantage because the president has the final say. Even though these executive orders do require coordination with the executive branch, at the end of the day, the president has the final say, so the president can act alone. So let me give you some examples of exactly what unilateral directives are. So these written statements that influence the law. So things like executive orders, signing statements, proclamation, memorandum, national security directives, executive agreements. These are the most common types of unilateral directives that we think of. For the sake of this presentation, I'm going to focus only on executive orders because I argue that this is the most important type of unilateral directive. One reason for that is, as opposed to all these other types of directives, this is the type that has the greatest legal status. So basically, the courts have ruled on this in previous court cases and basically see executive orders as equivalent to the law. Where these other ones are more informal, they don't have to necessarily be published as part of the law. The courts haven't decided whether or not these are what the legal status of these are. So I focus on executive orders because it has the most implication for actually changing what the law is because of its legal status in the courts. So let me give you a definition of exactly what an executive order is. So we define executive orders as unilateral directives that they're issued by the president and they're aimed towards executive branch officials or agencies in the government. And the purpose of these orders is to provide instruction to these agencies on how to implement the law or how to interpret the law. So it's basically telling these agencies to do something in terms of making the law, implementing the law, or basically how to interpret the law. And this has a lot of implications for the types of policies that we actually see happen. So executive orders have a wide range of functions. I'll go through some of these other functions, ranging from some more ceremonial functions to more policy substantive ones. I just want to give you a flavor of the different types of functions that executive orders can be used towards. So on the more trivial end of executive orders can be used for more ceremonial functions. So this can include a lot of times presidents issuing executive orders to maybe create a seal for an agency or create a new medal, like the Medal of Freedom created under Truman. A lot of times executive orders will be issued to send the executive branch home, so telling the executive branch employees that they don't have to come in for a holiday. So basically simple functions or ceremonial functions like that. So that's on the least consequential end of executive orders. Executive orders can also be used to create policy initiatives for the presidents. So an example I give here is under Lyndon Johnson in 1965. He issued Executive Order 11249. And this is an executive order that was directed towards government contractors, basically setting policies for government contractors that they weren't allowed to discriminate against their employees on the basis of race or sex or religion. A lot of different presidents since Johnson have built upon this executive order, extending the class that cannot be discriminated against. But this is a good example of a policy initiative under Lyndon Johnson, kind of towards his whole civil rights agenda. So this is what executive orders can be used towards. Another example of executive orders being used for policy initiatives is under George W. Bush, where he created the White House Office of Faith-Based and Community Initiatives right when he came into office. So this is another big policy initiative that he had during the time, and he created this White House office with this executive order to deal with that specific policy area. And this is common for presidents, particularly presidents first coming into office, to use executive orders to create some White House agencies that are going to deal with a lot of their new policy initiatives. So for example, in President Trump's first 8 months in office, he used executive orders to create 10 different White House agencies. And you can see a lot of these agencies dealing with maybe some of the issues that he wanted to deal with coming into office. So things like crime reduction, the opioid crisis, and things like that. So this is a common strategy for presidents. Another way that executive orders can be used is to respond to different sorts of crises. So the first type of crises is economic crises, that presidents can use executive orders to respond to kind of changes in the economy and especially crises during the economy. So a good example of this is during the 1970s, particularly when there was high inflation. President Nixon ordered a good number of executive orders that were meant to stabilize the economy in some sort of way. So in this executive order, he issued this freeze on rents, wages, and salaries, saying that it could not be increased, and issued this freeze for 90 days as a way to deal with the rising inflation to kind of stabilize that. Executive orders can also be used to deal with international crises. So for instance, during the Iran hostage crisis in the 1970s and early 1980s, President Carter issued a number of executive orders that were intended to basically punish the government of Iran. So putting certain sanctions on that country, blocking property, things going in and out of that country. He did this through executive order. And then when Reagan took office, he reversed these policies, kind of when that crisis was winding down. Probably the one most important function of executive orders is the ones used to interpret the law. So a lot of times, as I mentioned before, executive orders instruct agencies on how they're supposed to interpret the law. And a lot of times they're interpreting law that it's vague from statutes. So when there's some ambiguity in the statutes, the president can come in and issue an executive order and tell agencies exactly how he or she wants those agencies to interpret the law. And in this way, this can expand the authority of agencies and the presidents. So just to kind of take a step back and show you where agencies come in to implementing the law, just kind of show you the process of policy being made. So initially, we know Congress passes the law, passes a bill. The president can sign the bill into law. And when that's signed in that bill, or the now newly passed law, Congress usually gives instructions to agencies on how they're supposed to interpret the law or how they're supposed to implement the law. So actually turning that written law into actual effective policy. Congress is supposed to give instructions to agencies in the law on how to do that. But a lot of times these instructions are vague or leaves room for interpretation. So agencies take those instructions and with those instructions use them to write regulations. And that's when what we actually see becomes policy. So because, as I mentioned before, that a lot of times these instructions that Congress gives to agencies can be vague, it can be ambiguous, this leaves room for the president to come in and issue an executive order to offer his or her interpretation of the law, to tell agencies, this is how Congress meant the law to be. This is how I want you to interpret the law. And agencies take those to make regulations to actually implement the law. So you can see executive orders are very powerful in that way to kind of fill in the dots where statutes have left off. So some examples of that, of an executive order used to implement the law or interpret the law. So I just want to give you some context, just an example. In 2011, under the Obama administration, there was a drug shortage crisis. So there was a lot of drug shortages that were leading to a few instances of deaths where people were just not having access to the drugs that they needed because manufacturers were stopping the production of certain critical life-saving drugs. And so you can see the number of shortages starting from 2005 to 2011, that it dramatically increased during this time period. So in this law, the FDA, in the Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act, it specifies that drug manufacturers who discontinue the production of some sort of drug, that they're supposed to give advance notification of when they are going to discontinue a drug. But the problem here was that drug manufacturers just weren't following this provision, that they were just all of a sudden discontinuing the production of drugs, and this was leading to this drug shortage, this crisis at the time. The FDA claimed that this law didn't give them any authority to actually enforce this provision that required manufacturers to give prior notification. So you can see this as a testimony here from the associate director saying that the FDA just doesn't have enough authority right now to actually enforce this from the law. So this is where the executive order stepped in. During this time, President Obama issued an executive order that reinterpreted this law, giving the FDA broader authority to actually enforce this provision. You can see the text of the executive order saying that the FDA can use the appropriate tools to actually require manufacturers to provide advance notice. So this is an example of an executive order coming in and offering an interpretation of the law to let the agency just do more. So these sorts of examples are very common with what we see presidents using executive orders for. Another example of kind of the importance of executive orders in interpreting the law are the series of travel bans that President Trump issued in 2017. So the first two travel bans started off as executive orders, the last one being a proclamation, the third one being a proclamation. These were challenged in court. One big question that came up was, does the president have the authority under this previous law, the Immigration and Nationality Act of 1965, to actually order the travel ban? And in the text of the act, it gives president some sort of authority to act in this policy area, but it was unclear whether or not the president had the authority to pick the countries in the way that the president did. And you can see the Supreme Court in Trump versus Hawaii in 2018 stepping in and specifically interpreting that section and saying that the president's use of the executive order was in accordance with that section. So the president had the ability to do that. The president was given ample power. So again, just another example of executive orders being important in interpreting the law and the interactions the president has with the law when using executive orders. And this is why they're very important in having different policy implications. The president can do a lot with these. So I just want to go into talking about now more of the implications of executive orders. I'll show you a video of this, and then I'll show you exactly how presidents have used executive orders over time. I'll show you some numbers. Let's see if this video works.
We now return to a brand new episode of Schoolhouse Rock.
Boy, you really have to climb a lot of steps to get to this Capitol building in Washington, D.C. Say, what's that piece of paper doing here?
Oh, you mean me? I tell you who.
Sorry, I'm just going to pause it for a second and try to turn this up. I will resume. Let's see what I can do. All right, this is about as loud as I can get it on here. Let's try this again. Okay. Well, now I can't hear it at all. Well, I tried to get it louder. I tried this one. This one. I'm sorry? Is this one? The yellow line. Oh, this one? This one? That's the Zoom. I think that's the Zoom one. Let's try this one. Okay. That one. Okay.
We now return to a brand new episode of Schoolhouse Rock. Now return to a brand new episode of Schoolhouse Rock.
Boy, you really have to climb a lot of steps to get to this Capitol building in Washington, D.C. Say, what's that piece of paper doing here?
Oh, you mean me? I tell you who I am. I'm just a bill. Yes, I'm only a bill. And I'm sitting here on Capitol Hill. But I know I'll be a law someday. At least I hope and pray that I will. But today I am still just a bill.
Cool. What kind of bill are you?
Why, I'm an immigration bill. And one day the Republicans might create me so I could become a law.
And how does a bill become a law?
Funny you should ask. Well, first I go to the House and they vote on me. But then I need from the Senate a majority. And if I pass the legislative test, then I wind up on the president's desk. And I say, my sweet Woodrow Wilson. My legs, they were made of paper.
President Obama, what's the big idea? That bill was trying to become a law.
I realize that. But you know, son, there's actually an even easier way to get things done around here. It's called an executive order.
I'm an executive order, and I pretty much just happened. And that's it.
Wait a second, don't you have to go through Congress at some point?
Oh, that's adorable. You still think that's how government works?
Don't listen to him, son. Look at the midterm elections. People clearly don't want this. Oh, you black ass! Why did I come back? I think I landed on my keys.
Mr. President, is this constitutional?
Of course. Presidents issue executive orders all the time.
That's right. I could do lots of things. I'll create a national park or a new holiday.
Or grant legal status to 5 million undocumented immigrants.
Wait, what?
Yep, that's what you're gonna do.
Oh, my God. Well, I didn't have time to read myself. Whoa! Okay, go big or go home, huh?
This isn't over. We're gonna take you to court. We're gonna shut down all the college. So many steps. So many steps.
Well, son, what do you think about the government now?
I think I want to go into the private sector.
Me too, son. Me too. One more thing.
Live from New York inside!
So this video, I mean, it's good just to kind of show you the implications of an executive order, right? The president can easily get things done outside of Congress, doesn't need Congress around. And what's interesting here, so obviously this skit, the Saturday Night Live skit, was done after Obama had issued the executive order about immigration expanding DACA. And it's interesting that immigration has remained through the Trump presidency a very salient issue in common use for an executive order too. So now I want to talk more specifically about how presidents have used executive orders. You hear executive orders a lot in the media, and there are certain things that the media says that don't get executive orders right. So there's a couple of myths that I want to dispel about executive orders, and then we'll move forward to how political scientists talk about executive orders as well. So the first myth that we see is that presidents, particularly most recent presidents, have increasingly issued more executive orders over time. So in the media, you hear about like every president uses more and more executive orders, that this has increased over time. This is the narrative that we hear in the media. But this actually is not true. So this is the number of executive orders issued by year between 1820, when the first recorded executive order existed, through 2017, the first year of the Trump administration. And as we see that their presidents, compare it to this kind of the first half of the 20th century, modern presidents have used substantially fewer executive orders than those presidents in the early 20th century. So here you see spikes in executive orders starting with Theodore Roosevelt at the turn of the 20th century, he was using a lot of executive orders related to land. That was a salient issue around that time. And then you see spikes of executive orders corresponding to World War I and World War II, in addition to the Great Depression, so around that era. So a lot of these executive orders being used to respond to some sort of crisis in this time. And now I want to show you the average number of executive orders by president, their yearly average, starting with Theodore Roosevelt. And so you can see more specifically executive orders tied to each president. And you see, again, these early presidents issuing a higher average number of executive orders than these later presidents. And so there's two things that I want to point out. So under Obama, a lot of the times under the Obama administration, we heard from the media, we heard particularly from conservatives, that Obama has issued more executive orders than any other president. You can see him issuing executive orders, average of 35 executive orders per year, and that was lower than every president since Reagan during that time, well, even before that, in the modern era. And then I want to point to Trump. So a lot of people say Trump has used more executive orders than previous presidents, which is true to a certain extent if we go back looking at Reagan, but before then, Trump's use of executive orders are lower than other previous presidents. So just looking at the numbers, it can kind of speak truth to what we hear in the media. Now I want to do some comparisons on the average number of executive orders that presidents use in their first year. Well, I should say this is the total number of executive orders that presidents use in their first year. And so you can see in the first year, President Trump used 55 executive orders. You can compare that to the 39 issued under Obama. And then Trump's 55 is on par with what we've seen with previous presidents, particularly Clinton, George W. Bush. So just to give you kind of some knowledge about how presidents look in comparison to other presidents, particularly these earlier presidents that really relied a lot more on executive orders than we do now. So the second myth that I want to dispel that we hear a lot in the media is that presidents issue more executive orders under divided government than under unified government. So the thought here is, in the media, we hear a lot of fears about an unconstrained president, presidents using a lot more power, particularly to get their way. And so we hear a lot in the media about presidents using executive orders to get around Congress. If Congress is getting in their way, if Congress is disagreeing with what the president wants, presidents can just issue executive orders to get around Congress. And in a New York Times article, particularly talking about the Obama administration, this article talked about this is how presidents usually behave, that they'll issue more executive orders during divided government, that the unilateral actions will become more aggressive. But in contrast, there's been several studies in political science looking at the empirical evidence of when presidents use executive orders. And on the whole, there's a huge consensus across this literature that presidents issue fewer executive orders under divided government. So when the president and Congress are from different parties, empirically we see presidents issuing fewer executive orders, which is counter to what we hear in the media, is probably counter to our own intuitions about what we think about executive orders. And again, just to show you some more numbers, these bar graphs show the average number of executive orders under unified versus divided government. So the top bar is the average number of executive orders under divided government, so that's 73, versus the 50 average executive orders that are issued under divided government on average. So you can see in the numbers here in front of us that during this time period, presidents relying more on executive orders when Congress is on their side versus fewer executive orders when Congress is from an opposing party. So why is this the case? Why is it the case that it looks like presidents are using restraints under divided governments when we would think presidents would want to use more executive orders to get around Congress? So typically in our political science research, we argue that Congress has a lot of different ways that they can punish the president for issuing an executive order that they don't like. So a lot of different ways. So for instance, a president might issue an executive order that might empower agencies to do something, but Congress can retaliate against that executive order. Congress might pass legislation to defund that executive order or the programs related to that executive order. They might pass legislation that blocks the president's legislative program in another way, or pass legislation that directly overturns that executive order. And there are also other ways, even outside the legislative process, that Congress can retaliate against the president. So for instance, Congress might punish the president by blocking the president's nominees in the confirmation process for the federal judiciary or for the executive branch. Congress might engage in more active oversight hearings, call more hearings of executive branch officials, investigate the president in all sorts of manner. Congress might also limit the discretion of agencies. So to talk a second about discretion, usually all of the president's unilateral actions, particularly these directives, these executive orders, they have to rely on discretion. So discretion, comes from statutes usually, and it's the leeway that Congress gives to the president in how to implement the law and how far the president can go in implementing the law or an executive branch agency. So when the president issues an executive order, he usually cites that I have the authority to issue this executive order, and usually cites a particular statute. Or can vaguely cite the Constitution, but the stronger executive orders usually cite a specific statute that they can point to where the Congress has given them authority to do that. And oftentimes, the courts decide whether or not to uphold an executive action based on its interpretation of whether or not the president actually has the proper discretion or authority to issue that executive order. And this has been a case in a couple court cases. So in Youngstown v. Sawyer, this is the case where President Truman issued an executive order to seize the production of steel mills during the strike that was happening during that time. And the court overturned that executive order and said that based on the law, the president did not have the authority or the discretion to issue that executive order. On the other hand, in this recent case on the immigration orders, the travel ban in Trump v. Hawaii, the court said that the president did, from their reading of that statute, have the authority or the discretion to issue that executive order. So it's very important, and discretion is very important in determining whether or not presidents can issue executive orders, whether or not they're actually going to be upheld in the eyes of the law. And so because Congress controls that discretion, that's another way that they can punish presidents, by giving them lower numbers of discretion. So because Congress has all these tools that it can use to punish the president or limit the president's ability to issue these executive orders, presidents can be pretty constrained by Congress in issuing executive orders. And we would think that they're more constrained under divided government, where Congress has the most incentives to punish the president for issuing executive orders. Whereas under unified government, Congress is on the same page as the president. Congress is less likely to engage in these sorts of punishment mechanisms. So this is a theoretical explanation that we use to explain why presidents use fewer executive orders under divided government when Congress is more likely to retaliate against them. Okay, so now let's go to our very last part of this lecture, which is thinking about how might the midterm election influence President Trump's use of unilateral powers? So again, focusing on executive orders, I just want to show you the average number of executive orders that presidents have issued in different parts of their administration. So this is the average number in each year of their administration, spanning from the first year through the fourth, and then if they want a second term, year 5, 6, 7, 8. And so you can see the patterns of issuance of executive orders by each year in their term. So the first year issuing 66 on average, the second year issuing 68. And so at the end of the second year, this is when the midterm election comes. And so between the second and the third year, we usually see a drop in the average number of executive orders right after the midterm elections, where we see kind of in year 3 and 4 at 59. Then we go to year 4. This is when presidents are up for re-election. We also have, again, some more congressional elections. But then after that, then we see another dip in the president's use of executive orders. And then we see a slight recovery at the end. So a general pattern, more executive orders at the beginning of the term, then it decreases after midterms elections, kind of stays low in the middle of the term, and then increases at the end of the term. So now I want to offer you some explanations for why we might see this pattern, and specifically thinking about why we might see this drop after midterm elections. Early in the term, where we see presidents using a lot of unilateral actions, this is when presidents are first coming into the office, they're coming off the election, this is when they might have more political capital, and this is also when they want to establish their policy agenda. So they're going to be very active in getting things done, both through the legislative process, if they can, and also through unilateral actions. And this is also a time where they're reversing a lot of previous policies. And then in the middle of the term, we're going to see decreases in their seat share in Congress, and I'll talk more about that. And then late in the term, we're going to see maybe an increase because of some legacy concerns, and this is when they're a lame duck president. So let me talk about each of these phases. So let's first talk about early in the term. So early in the term, presidents usually issue a lot of executive orders directly related to their salient policy agendas that they want. So for instance, during Trump's first year, we see a lot of executive orders that he issued related to immigration. So you see the first 2 travel bans. You see an executive order related to federal funding cuts to sanctuary cities. You see an executive order that instructs agencies to look into how going about building the wall. So a lot of these executive orders trying to fulfill some of these campaign promises, which is very typical of presidents in their first year of office. Also during Trump's first year, you see things related to government and regulatory reform. So you have his 2-for-1 regulation repeal. This executive order that President Trump issued that required that for every one regulation that agencies promulgate, that they're supposed to repeal 2 regulations. So this is part of President Trump's agenda of deregulation. And then you have other sorts of deregulatory efforts in different specific policy areas as well. And then other different policy areas ranging from trade to finding ways to repeal the Affordable Care Act. All of these things happened through executive order in Trump's first year. Very active agenda. So another typical thing that we see in presidents in their first year is that they go and that they try to reverse policies that other presidents have made in a way to kind of make room for their own policy agendas. So there are 3 different ways that presidents can change executive orders through new executive orders. So they can revoke an executive order, which completely nullifies its legal status, so it's basically completely eradicated. It can amend an executive order, which it can go in and basically rewrite the executive order or change its context. Or it can supersede an executive order. This one is kind of an ambiguous category. I think presidents themselves don't know exactly what to do with it, but this basically technically suspends the legal status of an executive order. So it can be effectively used as a revocation or an amendment. So presidents in their first year, this is the number of executive orders that they've revoked, amended, or superseded. And you can see that presidents are pretty active in changing previous executive orders, in reversing their policies or amending previous policies. Again, pretty typical of presidents who are in their first year are trying to pursue active policy agendas. And part of that is getting rid of the policy agendas from previous presidents. And I will say most of these executive orders that are revoked in a president's first year, it's revoking executive orders made by the previous president right before them. So some examples of that, President Trump revoked an Obama order that laid some guidelines for flood readiness. This was actually poor timing because I think a couple of weeks after that there was a big hurricane that happened. And then Trump also revoked Obama executive orders laying out some labor requirements that government contractors were supposed to follow for labor standards and things like that. And then President Trump also revoked executive orders under Obama that related to climate change. So again, other big areas of policy that the president is using executive orders to clear out other executive orders. So this is what we see in the early years, the first 2 years, particularly in the first year of a president's term, active use of unilateral policies. Then we can have the middle of the term. And if you remember in that graph, the middle of the term is when we saw a decrease in the number of executive orders used, particularly right after the midterm elections. So we can think about why exactly this is the case. One reason that I wanted to point to is that usually for every president in their first term, after that midterm election, all presidents have lost seats in the House or the Senate. So this is a figure, it goes from president to president. It shows you how many seats their party lost in both the House and the Senate. And you can see from Eisenhower through Obama that in both the House and the Senate, for the most part, presidents lose seats in their party. With the exception, you can see in 1998 and 2002, where Clinton and George W. Bush actually gained seats. You can think about the 2002 election being right off the heels of September 11th, so a lot of support for the president there. 1998, so a booming economy, people were pretty happy with the president. So those are kind of exceptions. But in general, presidents lose seats in Congress at the midterm election. And so this might be one reason why we see a decrease in executive orders. Because like I mentioned before, if we have a shift from unified to divided government, presidents are much more constrained in their use of unilateral actions under divided government. And we can see what this might look like after the midterm elections on Tuesday. So this is just kind of the forecast of where we are. Predictions of whether Democrats or Republicans are going to win the Senate and the House. So starting with the Senate, we see 44 seats securely for the Democrats, 50 seats securely for the Republicans, and 6 seats that are currently a toss-up as of yesterday. So there is a possibility that if those 6 seats go to the Democrats, that the Senate will be stalemated there. But more interestingly is the House. Right now in the House, we have Republican control, as we do with the Senate. But with the House, there's a higher probability that the House is going to go to the Democrats after the midterm election. You see right now 204 seats securely for the Democrats, 199 seats securely for the Republicans with 32 toss-up seats. So there's a good chance that we might see a shift to Democratic control. So if this happens, then we're going to go to divided government. So right now we have unified government, where both the House and the Senate are from the Republican Party, aligned with the president. We might see a shift to divided government. And based on our theories of political science about when presidents use executive orders, we would predict that presidents would issue fewer executive orders under divided government, which is what we might see after this midterm election. Additionally, what happens during a president's term is that their popularity inevitably goes down for every single president. So this shows the president's public approval rating across each administration, and each administration has its own colored line. So you can see the way that each of those lines change throughout their term. And usually throughout the term, you see this decreasing trend. Presidents become unpopular. There's a lot of different reasons for that. One, during the president's term, you have more opportunities for the opposition to mobilize against the president. Also, during the president's term, at the beginning of the term and during the campaign, the president made a lot of campaign promises. And you can see throughout the term, the president inevitably not meeting those campaign promises, and so more people being dissatisfied with the president. And then also the president being blamed for a lot of different things that go on during the term. So it's a pretty typical pattern that president's approval goes down during the term. So we can think about that in relation to our expectations for how President Trump's executive orders might go down during the term. We have a lot of different studies that look at how presidents need public approval, that with the public on the president's side, the president can do a lot of different things. It's easier to pass the president's legislative agenda. It's easier for the president to get the public to go along with certain things that the president is doing. So this might translate to the use of unilateral actions as well. As the president's approval declines during the president's term, that might also explain why we see declining use of unilateral actions. the public not being on the president's side. And then we have the end of the president's term, maybe the final 2 years of the president's term. And if you remember in our figure, across presidents, we usually see a slight increase at the end of the president's term in the president's use of unilateral actions. So we can think during this time, presidents are lame duck presidents. In other words, they can't run for re-election. So they may not be constrained in trying to hold themselves in at the end of the term. They may find more freedom, which is why we might see an increase in unilateral actions. Another reason is presidents might think about their legacy concerns. They might think they still have a little bit of opportunity to do something big that's going to affect the way that they're seen in history. So we see presidents might be pursuing more active unilateral policies because they're trying to make a big splash before they go. And then also you can think about what we see happens at the end of a president's term in terms of other actions they take. So this is when we see the president doling out all of the pardons. This is when we see the president engaging in a lot of rulemaking, what we call midnight rulemaking, trying to get a lot of regulatory things done before ending. And then this also corresponds, like I said before, to an increase in unilateral actions. Again, president's not being reelected, so it's less constrained in that way. Also caring about his or her legacy. Just kind of sum up what my predictions would be for Trump's unilateral actions after the midterms. The president's going to lose seat in Congress. We'll have a shift from unified government to divided government. President's approval is going to continue to decline. There's going to be less push for new policy agenda. That phase is going to end. And so because of all that, we'll see a decrease in executive orders. But I will say there could be an increase in other types of unilateral actions. So in recent years, particularly under the Obama administration, we've seen an increase in the use of presidential memoranda. So this is another type of unilateral directive. So these are very similar to executive orders in that they give direction or instructions to agencies on how to implement the law, often used in conjunction with executive orders. But one clear difference between executive orders and memoranda is that it's very unclear what the legal status of memoranda is. They're less formal than executive orders. They're not viewed as part of the law like executive orders are. So you can think about memoranda as being the informal version of an executive order. So over time, we've seen an increase generally in executive orders, or not executive orders, memoranda. If you compare that to executive orders, remember I showed you executive orders have been decreasing over time, but memoranda have been increasing over time. So it could suggest that presidents might be starting to use memoranda as a substitute for executive orders. And if we look at the average number of memoranda issued under divided versus unified government, here we see presidents issuing a lot more memoranda under divided government, as we would expect. This is the opposite trend of what we saw with executive orders. So more suggestion that maybe memoranda are being used as substitutes for executive orders. And then I want to talk quickly, I'll get past this so that I can, just a couple more slides and then maybe I'll leave some time for some questions. So another unilateral tool that presidents have been using recently in more important ways are proclamations. So proclamations are directives issued by the president that are declaring something. So it's thought to be that the audience of proclamations are those outside of government, whereas executive orders and memoranda are directed for those inside of government. So usually proclamations have been used for lots of ceremonial purposes, like National Hug-a-Tree Day or something like that. But recently, proclamations have been used for very important substantive purposes, like the federal government seizing ownership of land across the country. Or, as I mentioned before, Trump's final version of his travel ban happened through a proclamation. So it could be that presidents might be repurposing proclamations for more substantive purposes. So that might be something we might keep an eye out on, that presidents might rely more on if they're constrained with executive orders. And then finally, I want to get back to that executive order that we saw the video of, Trump's proposed executive order on this birthright citizenship issue. So a big question people have been asking about this order is why now? It's interesting timing that He talked about this executive order a week before the election. So there could be some reasons why, he might plan this. Some people might think he was wanting to issue the executive order before he lost congressional support. That's probably implausible because it doesn't seem like this executive order is far in the process. It's going to take some time for it to get vetted, for it to get written. So it's probably going to be issued most certainly after the new Congress takes a hold. So we might shift to divided government. The probably main reason people point to why President Trump is announcing this executive order is to mobilize a conservative base. With anti-immigration sentiments being pretty pervasive across a lot of his core supporters, this is a way of trying to kind of stir up some of that anti-integration sentiment with just talking about this executive order to get people to the polls, to hopefully hold on, for them to hopefully hold on to the House and the Senate. But there are some unintended consequences. So in addition to mobilizing the conservative base, it can also mobilize the liberal base against this. Also, something that's interesting is that we're already seeing opposition against this proposed executive order from members of the president's own party, some of the Republican leadership in Congress opposing this executive order. So that's obviously not good for building morale among the party. And then this executive order already is raising lots of constitutional problems. Practically every article that I've read, legal scholars talking have said that this executive order, if he issued this, is unconstitutional, that it directly conflicts with the 14th Amendment, and this is something that the courts should come in and stop, and certainly will be stopped, at least in the lower courts. So raising that sort of negative attention might have some backlash effects too, with Trump's strategy in mobilizing his base with executive orders. So that's kind of just an interesting case, but just on the whole, my prediction would be fewer executive orders after these midterm elections. Okay, so with that, I'm done talking, and I'd be happy to take any of your questions. Yes?
With President Trump, it is apparent that he often throws out a subject and says, I'm going to issue an executive order, and it looks like he's testing the waters. To what extent have previous presidents used the same tactic?
So I think the interesting thing about Trump is, like you said, he does throw out the topic of executive orders like that. I don't think previous presidents have engaged in that level of testing. So it might be the case that a president will announce ahead of time that he's going to issue an executive order, but by that time the executive order has already been vetted through the Office of Legal Counsel and various offices within the White House too. I think President Trump is unique in that, for a lot of reasons, but unique in that this sort of vetting doesn't happen at this stage. And even in these early travel bans, after he issued the travel ban, these first two travel bans, they weren't vetted. So in terms of like announcing these executive orders or testing the waters, I think that's unique because it's coming way earlier than any other president would announce an executive order. Yes, in the back. Oh, my reaction to that? Yeah, that's a terrible idea. I mean, part of having a democratic system. Oh, the question was that there's been ideas floated around from the administration that a president should be elected for life. And the gentleman in the back wanted to know my thoughts about that. I said that was a terrible idea. A threat, obviously, to our democratic system. Part of having a democracy is having the ability to keep our elected officials accountable, and that would completely blow that out of the water. So, terrible idea. Any other questions? Yes?
Tariffs, what do they call it? The tariffs that he put on different countries?
So the tariffs has been a combination of executive orders, memoranda, and to some extent proclamations. So kind of a mixture of all of those. So I should say, when it comes to proclamations, traditionally proclamations are used in response to Congress setting some sort of tariffs, and it's the president implementing those proclamations, implementing those tariffs through proclamations. So in that respect, those are more reactionary. But the ones used for through executive orders and memoranda, some of them are in conjunction with Congress and others not. Yes?
Could the president issue an executive order questioning the outcome of the election?
I would have said no before, but I guess that's something. That's something that he could do. Yeah, it's hard. It's hard for me to predict the actions of this president. Traditionally, presidents no, but anything could happen these days. Yes.
Well, as a follow-up to that question, we had a session on the Supreme Court, and they talked about left, right, where it stood. So on this issue of executive authority, does it fall liberal, conservative, or is it a different animal altogether? In other words, what would we predict this court would do with the executive order to investigate the election?
Yeah, so when you look at how the court decides on executive issues, particularly in recent years, it has been very partisan motivated. So you see the courts upholding, so we would expect like a conservative court usually to hold up a Republican president's actions. With the case of this particular proposed executive orders on the birthright citizenship, it might be hard just because from what I've read, from legal scholars, it's very cut and dry about how it violates the 14th Amendment. I think Trump is hoping that the Supreme Court would offer an alternative interpretation of the 14th Amendment. So I think people suspect the court should overrule it, but because of how partisan it is, especially since he got Kavanaugh on the court replacing Kennedy, who was much more moderate, that the Supreme Court could likely uphold the executive order if it was issued. But I will say it's going to likely be blocked on the federal level and blocked in the Court of Appeals. So it's just a matter of whether the Supreme Court decides to take up the case or not, which it could be something they might want to avoid. Yes?
He did backpedal on the travel ban, and then there was at least one federal court that upheld it. If you look at Dred Scott, the principle there was that because the people weren't property, this sounds outrageous even to say,
Yeah.
because the people weren't property, therefore their children could not be citizens because he didn't start with American citizens. It seems to me that that's going to be his argument here, that because the illegal immigrants aren't legal, they can't be the predicate of legal Americans. Do you think anybody on the Supreme Court would agree with that?
Oh yeah, so he was saying that with this proposed executive order that Trump might rely on this argument from the Dred Scott case that because, in the Dred Scott case it was because these people were property and not citizens themselves that their children couldn't be citizens. And so the argument here is that Trump will rely on these sorts of arguments to issue this executive order. And the question was whether or not the Supreme Court would agree with that. I think there's a real possibility that they could, particularly with how conservative the Supreme Court is. In general, I think relying on the Dred Scott case is a terrible precedent to rely on. But I think there's a real possibility with how conservative the court has become, and particularly with Trump being able to make the court more conservative with his recent appointment.
That's scary. I agree with her.
Yeah. Yes, in the back.
Founding fathers set up the three branches of government as checks and balances. Some of the Supreme Court justices say they call them originalists, so that they read it very, the way it is. It seems to be a disconnect here between the politicization of it and this sort of an attitude. Do you have any comment on that?
Yeah, so it's my opinion. that a lot of judge and justices, oh, sorry, just to repeat the question, the question was that, a lot of Supreme Court justices claim that they're originalists, or basically that they have a strict interpretation of the Constitution when reading its text. But how does that kind of conform with the politicization of the courts that we see? So what I would say to that is that I think people, justices and judges, say that they have a strict reading of the Constitution, but I think that there is enough ambiguity in the Constitution that you can have you can say that the reading is strict in such a way to justify your own political leanings. And I think that's certainly what we've seen on the Supreme Court, judges, I mean, really throughout time too. So I think people can kind of say they're reading the Constitution in a certain way and can pick things out to justify their own leanings. Yes?
Has birthright citizenship been the law ever since the 14th Amendment was passed, or did it really start due to some order or interpretation in the 1960s?
So it's definitely been the law since the 14th Amendment, but there's certainly been court cases that have upheld that certain interpretation of the 14th Amendment that have been kind of reaffirmed over time. Yes?
You talked about memorandum being a little more informal sort of thing, and it seems like one of the things that the current president likes is being able to sign things importantly.
Yeah.
Do you think that might make him lean toward using proclamations more after the midterms than we would traditionally see using the memorandum?
Yeah, so basically having this like big signing ceremony afterwards, that's going to motivate him. I don't know, it could. I mean, he certainly does like attention. I had never thought about that, but that is a good thought, seeing like what things that he signs in big signing ceremonies. I can't say that I've ever thought about that, but I think that's an interesting point and certainly possible. Yes?
With regards to, so a proclamation, how enforceable is that, or a memorandum as compared to an executive order? What is the enforceability?
I think they have similar levels of enforcement in terms of the president trying to communicate with the executive branch on that level. But I think on the legal level, it's more legally enforceable with the courts, just because the courts view executive orders as part of the law versus memorandum not. Yeah. Yes?
Going back to the possibility of a constitutional convention, is this one of the things that could be done in a constitutional convention?
Sorry.
Denying citizenship, birthright citizenship.
I mean, a constitutional convention could be called, and you could add an amendment to the Constitution that basically changes the language of the 14th Amendment or repealing the 14th Amendment. So that is possible, definitely.
Is the constitutional convention limited to specific items as are on the state level, or is it wide open?
No, it could be wide open and completely changing the Constitution. Any other questions? I think we have time for one more question. Yes, ma'am.
How would a constitutional convention, who would be the delegates?
Oh, geez. I think that's. Oh, she's asking, in a constitutional convention, who would be the delegates? I honestly have to brush up on my American constitutional history. But yes, ma'am, you have an answer to that.
I'm president of the League of Women Voters.
Yes.
A
Okay.
little bit of authority. That is the problem with the Constitutional Convention. There are no rules for how it works. No rules for how our state would choose delegates, what the scope of it would be, or anything. So that is why it is a really bad idea.
Well, with that glimpse of hope and optimism, this is the end of my time, but it has been a pleasure. Thank you for listening.